Chapter 19 of The Eye of Osiris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Eye of Osiris by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 19. A Strange Symposium. It came upon me with something of a shock of surprise to find the scrap of paper still tacked to the oak of Thorndyke's chambers. So much had happened since I had last looked on it that it seemed to belong to another epoch of my life. I removed it thoughtfully and picked out the tack before entering, and then, closing the inner door, but leaving the oak open, I lit the gas and fell to pacing the room. What a wonderful episode it had been! How the whole aspect of the world had been changed in a moment by Thorndyke's revelation! At another time, curiosity would have led me to endeavor to trace back the train of reasoning by which the subtle brain of my teacher had attained this astonishing conclusion. But now my own happiness held exclusive possession of my thoughts. The image of Ruth filled the field of my mental vision. I saw her again as I had seen her in the cab, with her sweet, pensive face and downcast eyes. I felt again the touch of her soft cheek and the parting kiss by the gate, so frank and simple, so intimate and final. I must have waited quite a long time, though the golden minutes sped unreckoned, for when my two colleagues arrived, they tendered needless apologies. "And I suppose," said Thorndyke, "you have been wondering what I wanted you for." I had not, as a matter of fact, given the matter a moment's consideration. "We are going to call on Mr. Jellicoe," Thorndyke explained. "There is something behind this affair, and until I have ascertained what it is, the case is not complete from my point of view." "Wouldn't it have done as well to-morrow?" I asked. "It might, and then it might not. There is an old saying as to catching a weasel asleep. Mr. Jellicoe is a somewhat wide-awake person, and I think it best to introduce him to Inspector Badger at the earliest possible moment." "The meeting of a weasel and a badger suggests a sporting interview," remarked Jervis. "But you don't expect Jellicoe to give himself away, do you?" "He can hardly do that, seeing that there is nothing to give away. But I think he may make a statement. There were some exceptional circumstances, I feel sure." "How long have you known that the body was in the museum?" I asked. "About 30 or 40 seconds longer than you have, I should say." "Do you mean," I exclaimed, "that you did not know until the negative was developed?" "My dear fellow," he replied, "do you suppose that, if I had had certain knowledge where the body was, I should have allowed that noble girl to go on, dragging on a lingering agony of suspense that I could have cut short in a moment, or that I should have made these humbugging pretenses of scientific experiments if a more dignified course had been open to me?" "As to the experiments," said Jervis, "Norbury could hardly have refused if you had taken him into your confidence." "Indeed he could, and probably would. My 'confidence' would have involved a charge of murder against a highly respectable gentleman who was well known to him. He would probably have referred me to the police, and then what could I have done? I had plenty of suspicions, but not a single solid fact." Our discussion was here interrupted by hurried footsteps on the stairs and a thundering rat-tat on our knocker. As Jervis opened the door, Inspector Badger burst into the room in a highly excited state. "What is this all about, Dr. Thorndyke?" he asked. "I see you've sworn an information against Mr. Jellicoe, and I have a warrant to arrest him. But before anything else is done, I think it right to tell you that we have more evidence than is generally known, pointing to quite a different quarter." "Derived from Mr. Jellicoe's information," said Thorndyke. "But the fact is that I have just examined and identified the body at the British Museum, where it was deposited by Mr. Jellicoe. I don't say that he murdered John Bellingham, though that is what appearances suggest, but I do say that he will have to account for his secret disposal of the body." Inspector Badger was thunderstruck. Also he was visibly annoyed. The salt which Mr. Jellicoe had so adroitly sprinkled on the constabulary tale appeared to develop irritating properties, for when Thorndyke had given him a brief outline of the facts, he stuck his hands in his pockets and exclaimed gloomily, "Well, I'm hanged! And to think of all the time and trouble I've spent on those damned bones! I suppose they were just a plant?" "Don't let us disparage them," said Thorndyke. "They have played a useful part. They represent the inevitable mistake that every criminal makes sooner or later. The murderer will always do a little too much. If he would only lie low and let well alone, the detectives might whistle for a clue. But it is time we are starting." "Are we all going?" asked the inspector, looking at me in particular with no very gracious recognition. "We will all come with you," said Thorndyke, "but you will, naturally, make the arrest in the way that seems best to you." "It's a regular procession," grumbled the inspector, but he made no more definite objection, and we started forth on our quest. The distance from the Temple to Lincoln's Inn is not great. In 5 minutes we were at the gateway in Chancery Lane, and a couple of minutes later saw us gathered round the threshold of the stately old house in New Square. "Seems to be a light in the first floor front," said Badger. "You'd better move away before I ring the bell." But the precaution was unnecessary. As the inspector advanced to the bell pull, a head was thrust out of the open window immediately above the street door. "Who are you?" inquired the owner of the head in a voice which I recognized as that of Mr. Jellicoe. "I am Inspector Badger of the Criminal Investigation Department. I wish to see Mr. Arthur Jellicoe." "Then look at me. I am Mr. Arthur Jellicoe." "I hold a warrant for your arrest, Mr. Jellicoe. You are charged with the murder of Mr. John Bellingham, whose body has been discovered in the British Museum." "By whom?" "By Dr. Thorndyke." "Indeed," said Mr. Jellicoe. "Is he here?" "Yes." "Ha! And you wish to arrest me, I presume?" "Yes, that is what I am here for." "Well, I will agree to surrender myself, subject to certain conditions." "I can't make any conditions, Mr. Jellicoe." "No, I will make them, and you will accept them. Otherwise, you will not arrest me." "It's no use for you to talk like that," said Badger. "If you don't let me in, I shall have to break in. And I may as well tell you," he added mendaciously, "that the house is surrounded." "You may accept my assurance," Mr. Jellicoe replied calmly, "that you will not arrest me if you do not accept my conditions." "Well, what are your conditions?" demanded Badger. "I desire to make a statement," said Mr. Jellicoe. "You can do that, but I must caution you that anything you say may be used in evidence against you." "Naturally. But I wish to make the statement in the presence of Dr. Thorndyke, and I desire to hear a statement from him of the method of investigation by which he discovered the whereabouts of the body. That is to say, if he is willing." "If you mean that we should mutually enlighten one another, I am very willing indeed," said Thorndyke. "Very well. Then my conditions, Inspector, are that I shall hear Dr. Thorndyke's statement, and that I shall be permitted to make a statement myself, and that until those statements are completed, with any necessary interrogation and discussion, I shall remain at liberty, and shall suffer no molestation or interferences of any kind. And I agree that, on the conclusion of said proceedings, I will submit without resistance to any course that you may adopt." "I can't agree to that," said Badger. "Can't you?" said Mr. Jellicoe coldly, and after a pause he added, "Don't be hasty. I have given you warning." There was something in Mr. Jellicoe's passionless tone that disturbed the inspector exceedingly, for he turned to Thorndyke and said in a low tone, "I wonder what his game is. He can't get away, you know." "There are several possibilities," said Thorndyke. Yes," said Badger, stroking his chin perplexedly. "After all, is there any objection? His statement might save trouble, and you'd be on the safe side. It would take you some time to break in." "Well," said Mr. Jellicoe, with his hand on the window, "do you agree? Yes or no?" "All right," said Badger sulkily. "I agree." "You promise not to molest me in any way until I have quite finished?" "I promise." Mr. Jellicoe's head disappeared and the window closed. After a short pause we heard the jar of massive bolts and the clank of a chain, and as the heavy door swung open, Mr. Jellicoe stood revealed, calm and impassive, with an old-fashioned office candlestick in his hand. "Who are the others?" he inquired, peering out sharply through his spectacles. "Oh, they are nothing to do with me," replied Badger. "They are Dr. Berkeley and Dr. Jervis," said Thorndyke. "Ha!" said Mr. Jellicoe. "Very kind and attentive of them to call. Pray come in, gentlemen. I am sure you will be interested to hear our little discussion." He held the door open with a certain stiff courtesy, and we all entered the hall led by Inspector Badger. He closed the door softly and preceded us up the stairs and into the apartment from the window of which he had dictated the terms of surrender. It was a fine old room, spacious, lofty, and dignified, with paneled walls and a carved mantelpiece, the central escutcheon of which bore the initials J.W.P. with the date 1671. A large writing table stood at the farther end, and behind it was an iron safe. "I have been expecting this visit," Mr. Jellicoe remarked tranquilly, as he placed 4 chairs opposite the table.